Let me tell you about the most monumentally stupid diplomatic incident in the history of the known universe. I was there. I saw it all unfold. And now, as I float in this escape pod hurtling through the void between star systems, I have nothing but time to record this cautionary tale. My name is Zyx'Talon. I'm what you'd call a diplomatic attaché for the Pleiadian Federation, though after what happened, I doubt there's much diplomacy left to attach to. The humans have a saying, history is written by the victors. Well, I'm no victor, but someone needs to document how utterly ridiculous this whole affair was that IT started, as these things often do, with what should have been a routine diplomatic function. The Grand Galactic Peace Accord had been in effect for precisely 47 standard cycles. That's approximately 23 Earth years for those keeping score. Not a particularly long time in cosmic terms, but impressive considering the 5 major sentient species of the Orion Arm had spent the previous millennium trying to exterminate each other. The anniversary celebration was being held on Proxima Station, that gleaming monument to interspecies cooperation orbiting Jupiter's moon Europa. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, a massive 12-ring structure that rotated at precisely the right speed to create artificial gravity comfortable for all 5 species. The Arcturians had designed it. The Draconians had funded it. The Pleiadians, that's my people, had furnished it with our renowned biotechnology. The Syrians had programmed its systems. And the humans, well, they contributed the food court and entertainment district. Every species brings what they can to the table, I suppose. You're fidgeting again. Krasnoir, my superior, hissed through his respiratory slits. Apologies, Grand Coordinator. I whispered back, trying to still my secondary appendages which had been unconsciously tapping against my ceremonial sash. The human atmospheric mix is causing a mild histamine reaction in my quiet. Krasnoir cut me off as the double doors at the end of the reception hall swung open. General Bartholomew Thunder Jackson strode into the room with all the subtlety of a quantum detonation. The human military leader was bedecked in so many medals and ribbons that I genuinely worried about structural failure of his uniform. Behind him trailed his entourage, a collection of stern-faced military personnel and bureaucrats who looked perpetually constipated. Perhaps they were. Human digestive processes remain somewhat mysterious to me despite 3 cycles of xenobiology studies. The great General Jackson, Ambassador Klar of the Draconian Empire boomed, his scaled arms spread wide in greeting. The hero of the Orion conflict, the savior of the Sagittarius front, let's not oversell it, lizard lips, the general interrupted with what humans call a chuckle, but sounds more like respiratory distress to Pleiadian ears. Just doing my job, though I will say that business at Sagittarius was some of my finest work. Risky maneuver, splitting the fleet like that. Had to trust my gut. Military intuition, you know? I watched as Clar's neck frills flattened in barely concealed irritation. Draconians consider lizard a pejorative term, and for good reason. They're technically descended from avian ancestors who evolved scales as an adaptation to their harsh homeworld. But the ambassador was too experienced to take the bait. Indeed, your gut has served the galaxy well, Clar managed through gritted fangs. May I introduce you to the Pleiadian delegation? Grand Coordinator Krasnoir and Junior Attaché Zyx'Talon. The general's gaze fell upon us, and I felt my chromatophores involuntarily shift to a nervous lavender. The walking plants, right? He said, extending a hand toward Krasnoir. No offense intended. I've always admired your kind's photosynthesis abilities. We are primarily fungal in origin. Actually, Krasnoir corrected, tentatively wrapping a tendril around the general's hand in the human greeting custom. Though we do have some photosynthetic capabilities through symbiotic. Fascinating, General Jackson interrupted, clearly not fascinated in the slightest. His attention had already drifted to the Arcturian delegation across the room. Are those the ones with the telepathy? Now that's useful in warfare. Reading the enemy's mind, anticipating their moves. The Arcturians are empaths, not telepaths. I found myself saying before I could stop myself. They sense emotional states, not thoughts. And they are strict pacifists who refuse to participate in any military. Zyx'Talon, Krasnoir warned, his chromatophores flashing a dangerous crimson. No, it's fine, the general said with a dismissive wave. I like a subordinate who speaks their mind. Shows character. My adjutant, Colonel Patel, is the same way. Aren't you, Patel? A stern-faced human female stepped forward from the entourage. I prefer to think of it as providing necessary tactical perspective, sir. See, diplomatic sugarcoating doesn't win wars, General Jackson declared, helping himself to a glass of blue liquid from a passing server drone. He downed it in one gulp and immediately grimaced. What in God's name was that? Syrian fermented algae extract. I supplied helpfully. It's considered a delicacy. Tastes like someone wrung out a Jim's sock into a shot glass, the general muttered. Where's the whiskey? As if on cue, a human server appeared with a tray of amber liquid in crystal glasses. The general's face lit up. Now we're talking. Colonel, make sure our new friends here get a proper drink. Before I could politely decline, a glass was thrust into my manipulator tendril. I knew from my xenocultural sensitivity training that refusing would be considered an insult, so I dutifully raised the glass to my absorption membrane. The liquid burned like atmospheric entry as it dissolved into my cellular structure. My sensory interpretation network immediately began sending warning signals throughout my nervous system. Good stuff, right? The general asked, clapping me on what he probably thought was my shoulder, but was actually a reproductive spore sac. I managed not to release a cloud of gametes across the reception hall, which I consider my greatest diplomatic achievement to date. Quite intense, I managed as my translator struggled to find an appropriate descriptor that wouldn't offend. The evening progressed in similar fashion, the general loudly regaling anyone within earshot about his military exploits while consuming alarming quantities of whiskey. I observed with growing concern as his volume increased and his locomotion became increasingly erratic. Human intoxication protocols are dangerously unpredictable. It was during the formal dinner portion that things began to truly unravel. Part 2. The dinner at the Grand Banquet Hall of Proxima Station had been meticulously designed to accommodate the dietary needs and consumption methods of all 5 major species. The Draconians had their heated rocks for sunning during digestion. The Arcturians had their private meditation booths for their post-consumption energy conversion. The Syrians had their nutrient baths. We Pleiadians had our soil enrichment patches. And the humans had their long tables covered in white cloth, laden with more food than they could possibly consume. A bizarre tradition stemming from their history of resource scarcity. One assumes I had been strategically seated between Dr. MZRT of the Syrian Science Council and Lord High General TXLLK of the Arcturian Defense Force, a mostly ceremonial position, given their pacifism. Across from me sat General Jackson, who was by this point on his 7th whiskey and growing louder by the minute. And that's when I told the president, "Sir, with all due respect, if we don't hit them now at Alpha Centauri, we'll be fighting them in our own solar system next week." He didn't listen, of course. Politicians never do until it's too late. A most fascinating tactical assessment. Lord TXLLK said politely, though his bioluminescent cranial ridges were pulsing in the pattern that indicated extreme discomfort. Though I must note that historical records indicate the conflict at Alpha Centauri was initiated by human mining corporations violating the territorial. History is written by the victors, my glowing friend, General Jackson proclaimed, stabbing his fork into something that resembled meat, but had been synthetically grown to be palatable to all protein-consuming species present. And let me tell you, if I had been given full tactical authority, the war would have ended 3 years earlier. Dr. MZRT's translucent membranes rippled in what I recognized as the Syrian equivalent of an eye roll. Hypothetical outcomes are statistically meaningless, General. The Treaty of Barnard Star was the only logical conclusion given the military and economic realities of the time. The general snorted. Treaty was a mistake. Gave away too much. The draconian labor colonies on Mars should have been completely dismantled, not just regulated. And don't get me started on the technology sharing clauses. Setting ourselves up for the next war. Mark my words. I noticed Ambassador Clark further down the table. His neck frills fully extended in alarm as he overheard this assessment of the treaty his people considered a major diplomatic victory. Perhaps, I ventured carefully, the imperfections of the treaty are precisely what make it valuable. By leaving all parties slightly dissatisfied, it ensures that everyone has invested interest in maintaining the peace rather than resuming conflict. General Jackson fixed me with a stare that humans might find intimidating, but to a Pleiadian looked more like he was suffering from ocular inflammation. "That's loser talk," he declared. "No offense to your species, but that kind of thinking is why the Pleiadians were almost wiped out in the initial conflicts." No killer instinct. The table fell silent. Even the Arcturians, who normally projected a field of calming empathic energy during social gatherings, seemed too shocked to function. "I believe you may be confusing us with the Procyon, General," I said quietly. "The Pleiadian Federation maintained neutrality throughout the early conflicts and served as mediators for the first 3 attempted peace negotiations." Right. The general waved dismissively. "The ones with the tentacles all look the same to me after a few drinks." "No offense." 7. Corrected Colonel Patel quietly from beside him. "What's that, Colonel?" That the general turned. 7 drinks, sir. Not a few. Are you counting my drinks, Patel?" The general's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Someone should be, sir." The colonel's expression remained professionally neutral, but I detected a subtle shift in her posture, what my xenobiology training identified as the human fight-or-flight preparation stance. Lord TXLLK cleared his throat, or rather pulsated his communication membranes in a manner similar to a throat clearing. Perhaps this would be an opportune moment to commence with the anniversary speeches. I believe Ambassador HFY of the Syrian Collective prepared a most eloquent address on the economic benefits of continued peace. Speeches. Perfect. General Jackson slapped the table hard enough to make the cutlery jump. "I've got a few words to prepare myself." He stood, somewhat unsteadily, and raised his glass. "In fact, I think I'll go first." I saw Colonel Patel's eyes widen in alarm. "Sir, the protocol officer specifically indicated that the speaking order had been, 'Protocol is for peacetime.'" "Colonel," the general cut her off. "And since when do humans wait for permission?" He tapped his knife against his glass with enough force that I feared it might shatter. When the room didn't immediately quiet, he shouted, "Attention!" The banquet hall fell silent, save for the soft bubbling of the Syrian nutrient baths. "Distinguished guests, fellow warriors, various entities," General Jackson began, swaying slightly. 23 years ago, the greatest conflict in galactic history came to an end. Not because any of us wanted it to, mind you, but because we had to. Resources depleted, populations decimated, entire star systems rendered uninhabitable. This was not the inspiring opening I had anticipated. "But here's what I want to know," the general continued, pointing his glass around the room. "What have we learned? Have we gotten stronger? Or have we gotten soft?" He focused particularly on the Arcturian delegation as he said this last part. Ambassador HFY of the Syrian Collective rose from his nutrient bath, translucent membranes quivering with indignation. "General Jackson, this is hardly the appropriate." "Let me finish, jelly body," the general interrupted. Several Syrians gasped audibly at the slur. "I'm making a point here. Peace is good for business, sure. Good for civilians. Good for politicians. But let's be honest with each other just this once. The only reason any of your species are even sitting at this table is because humanity showed mercy." I felt my chromatophores blanch to a horrified white. Krasnoir, seated at the far end of the table, had gone completely immobile. Our species' version of extreme stress response. We had the Draconians on the ropes at Tau Ceti. Could have pushed all the way to their homeworld. The Syrians were one fleet action away from total surrender after we took their main shipyards. And the Arcturians. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. Well, the Arcturians would have rolled over and shown their metaphorical bellies if we just looked at them sternly. Lord TXLLK's cranial ridges had darkened to a deep purple of distress. But true to their pacifist principles, he made no response. "Sir," Colonel Patel stood now, her voice low but firm. "I strongly suggest you conclude your remarks." "Almost done, Colonel." The general waved her off. "My point is this. Humanity was generous. Maybe too generous. So on this anniversary, I'd like to propose a toast." He raised his glass higher. "To peace through strength. Human strength. And to all our alien friends, you're welcome." He downed his drink in one gulp as the room remained frozen in horrified silence. And that's when Ambassador Clar of the Draconian Empire slowly rose to his full impressive height, neck frills fully extended, and uttered the words that would end galactic peace. Your victory was a statistical anomaly based on lucky tactical guesses rather than strategic brilliance. You are, as we say in the imperial tongue, vas chlor toprak, one who mistakes fortunate coincidence for personal competence. I knew enough Draconian to understand that the literal translation was considerably more vulgar and anatomically impossible. The room collectively held its breath, or equivalent respiratory function. Time seemed to slow as General Jackson processed the translator's rendition of Ambassador Clar's insult. His face underwent a fascinating transformation, cycling through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson that even my Pleiadian chromatophores would have difficulty replicating. "What?" he said with dangerous quietness. "Did you just say about my tactical decisions?" Ambassador Clar, perhaps emboldened by the 7 courses of traditional draconian fermented vegetation he had consumed, straightened his ceremonial armor. "I merely stated a mathematically verifiable fact. Your much-celebrated victory at the Battle of Proxima Centauri, for instance, succeeded despite your orders, not because of them. It was the independent action of your squadron commanders, particularly Admiral Hernandez's flanking maneuver, that carried the day." Colonel Patel stepped forward quickly. "Ambassador, the general has had a long day and perhaps too much to drink. I'm sure we can continue this discussion at a more appropriate. Is that what they teach in draconian military academies?" General Jackson interrupted, his voice rising. "That humanity just got lucky? That I just got lucky? We teach military history with accurate analysis." "Yes," Clar replied, his own translator working overtime to convey the subtle layers of condescension in his native tongue. "Your species' tendency to mythologize rather than analyze is precisely why we found your battle tactics so predictable. That did it. The proverbial straw that fractured the cameloid's spinal support structure, as humans might say." General Jackson lunged across the table with surprising agility for an intoxicated man of his age and stature. Several plates of synthesized diplomatic cuisine went flying as he grabbed for Ambassador Clar's ceremonial collar frills. "Predictable? I'll show you predictable," he roared. Fortunately for galactic diplomacy, though only temporarily, as it turned out, Colonel Patel and 2 other human military personnel intercepted the general before he could make physical contact with the draconian ambassador. Clar, for his part, had instinctively assumed the traditional combat stance of his people, neck frills fully extended and ceremonial claws unsheathed. "General Jackson," Colonel Patel's voice cut through the chaos with military precision. "Stand down, sir. That is an order." For a moment, just a moment, rational thought seemed to reassert itself in the general's alcohol-soaked neural pathways. He stopped struggling against his subordinate's restraint, breathing heavily. Then Ambassador Clar made what xenobiologists would later classify as the worst miscalculation in diplomatic history. He laughed. Not a human laugh, mind you. A draconian laugh is more like a series of hissing clicks produced by rapidly vibrating throat membranes. But the intent translated universally across species barriers. "How predictably human," the ambassador said, his translator struggling to keep up with his rapid speech. "When facts fail you, resort to physical intimidation. This is precisely why your species required the protection of the treaty's military limitations clauses. Your behavioral control is as underdeveloped as your strategic thinking." I have never seen a human move as fast as Colonel Patel did in that moment. She positioned herself directly between the general and the ambassador. "Ambassador Clar," she said with remarkable composure, "I formally request that you withdraw your comments and apologize to General Jackson as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy." The draconian ambassador's vertical pupils narrowed to slits. "I do not apologize for stating facts, Colonel. Perhaps if your commanding officer spent more time studying history and less time rewriting it to serve his ego, he would—" "That's IT." General Jackson broke free from his restrainers with surprising strength. Before anyone could react, he had grabbed a decorative ceremonial sword from the wall display, part of the historical exhibit commemorating the signing of the peace accord, and pointed it directly at Ambassador Clar. "I challenge you to a duel, you overgrown iguana. Right here, right now. We'll see who's predictable when I'm separating your scales from your hide." The collective gasp from the assembled dignitaries created a momentary drop in atmospheric pressure. I felt my moisture membranes instinctively secrete a protective coating. Ambassador Klar stared at the sword, then at the general. And then, to everyone's horror, he smiled, revealing rows of serrated teeth evolved for tearing through the tough vegetation of his homeworld, but terrifyingly effective against softer materials as well. "I accept," he said simply. Let me pause my narrative here to explain something about draconian culture that wasn't widely known among other species at the time. In draconian society, formal dueling had never been outlawed as it had been in most developed civilizations. In fact, it remained an integral part of their political system, with legislative deadlocks sometimes resolved through ritual combat. More importantly, a duel challenge accepted by a draconian ambassador constituted, by their ancient laws, a formal state of hostility between nations. General Jackson had inadvertently declared war. The next 47 minutes were the most chaotic of my diplomatic career. Grand Coordinator Krasnoir was frantically communicating with the Pleiadian High Council, requesting immediate evacuation protocols. The Arcturians, true to their pacifist nature, had already begun filing quietly toward their ships, their empathic senses overwhelmed by the emotional turbulence in the room. The Syrians, ever practical, were downloading all station data to portable quantum drives while simultaneously disabling shared technology systems to prevent their misuse in the coming conflict. Meanwhile, Colonel Patel had physically restrained General Jackson and was in the process of administering some sort of chemical sedative, all while maintaining a remarkably professional demeanor. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "The general speaks only for himself, not for Earth or the human alliance. We remain committed to the peace accord and all its provisions." But the damage was done. Ambassador Klar had already made a formal communication to the Draconian Imperial Fleet using priority override codes that hadn't been activated since the war. I found myself standing awkwardly near the dessert table with Dr. MZRT of the Syrian Science Council, both of us watching the diplomatic apocalypse unfold with scientific detachment. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Dr. MZRT burbled through his speech membranes. "How quickly social structures collapse once foundational assumptions are violated." "Indeed," I agreed, absently consuming a gelatinous cube that was either dessert or possibly a decorative piece. Though I'm more concerned with the immediate logistical challenge of evacuating before the Draconians deploy their phase disruptors. Dr. MZRT's translucent body rippled in what might have been a shrug. "The statistical probability of surviving the next solar rotation has decreased by approximately 73%. Unfortunate. I was scheduled to present my research on cross-species genome compatibility next week." A loud crash from across the room drew our attention. General Jackson, apparently fighting off the effects of whatever sedative Colonel Patel had administered, had broken free and was now barricaded behind an overturned table, clutching the ceremonial sword and shouting orders into his communication device. "This is General Bartholomew Jackson. Authorization code Thunder 79er Delta. I want the 7th Fleet at combat readiness and the orbital defense grid activated." "No, I'm not joking, Lieutenant. This is a direct order." Colonel Patel had commandeered another communication device and was frantically issuing counterorders. "This is Colonel Sanjana Patel, Executive Officer to General Jackson. The General is currently medically compromised. Countermand previous orders pending verification from Central Command. I repeat, the General is not in command capacity." On the Draconian side of the room, similar chaos reigned. Ambassador Klar was surrounded by his military attaches, all of them accessing portable tactical displays that should never have been brought to a diplomatic function. I caught fragments of their conversation through my translator, advanced combat units already deployed in the Tau Ceti system. Human defenses concentrated around their colony worlds. Optimal strike window closing in 17 standard hours. I turned to Dr. MZRT. "I believe we should evacuate immediately." "Agreed," the Syrian scientist replied. "Though I calculate that multiple hyperspace jumps will be necessary to reach neutral territory before hostilities render transit routes unsafe." We had just turned toward the exit when a deafening alarm began blaring throughout the station. The lighting shifted to a pulsing red emergency pattern that my visual receptors found highly disorienting. "Attention all personnel and guests. The station's automated system announced in all 5 major languages. Hostile vessels approaching. Defense protocols initiated. Please proceed to emergency evacuation points. Well, observed Dr. MZRT with remarkable calm. It appears the statistical models were optimistic. The probability of survival has now decreased by 89%. How reassuring. I replied, my chromatophores involuntarily shifting to stress-indicative patterns. We had just reached the corridor leading to the evacuation pods when the first impact rocked the station. I was thrown against a bulkhead, my semi-rigid endoskeleton absorbing most of the shock. Dr. MZRT, being primarily composed of various semi-solid tissues, simply splattered slightly against the opposite wall before reforming his cohesive shape. Fascinating, he noted. That was not a conventional weapons impact. I believe the Draconians have deployed their new phase-shifted resonance cannons. Technically a violation of Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the Weapons Limitations Clause. I'm sure the tribunal will note that in the post-war crimes investigation, I replied, helping him regain his locomotion, assuming anyone survives to hold one. We stumbled down the corridor as more impacts shook the station. Emergency force fields were activating randomly as systems failed, creating a maze-like obstacle course. Behind us, I could hear shouting in multiple languages as other diplomats and station personnel fled toward the evacuation points. Structurally unsound, Dr. MZRT observed as we passed a buckling bulkhead. This entire section will decompress in approximately 47 seconds. Then I suggest we increase our speed. I replied, extending my locomotion tendrils to their maximum stretch coefficient, that we reached the evacuation bay just as the final pods were being prepared for launch. The scene was chaos incarnate. Representatives from all 5 species fighting for space in the remaining pods, station security attempting to maintain order, and through it all, the constant booming of weapons fire against the station's failing shields. And there, remarkably, stood Colonel Patel, still maintaining order despite everything, directing evacuees with military precision. Syrians and Pleiadians in Pod 7, she shouted over the alarms. Arcturians in Pod 8. Move quickly but orderly. We have sufficient capacity if everyone follows directions. Dr. MZRT and I push our way toward Pod 7. As we approached, I noticed General Jackson being forcibly guided toward a separate pod by 2 human security officers. He was still shouting, though the effects of whatever sedative he'd been given were clearly taking hold. This is an act of war. The Draconians must be taught a lesson. I demand to be returned to my command post. Colonel Patel caught my eye as I passed her position. For a brief moment, something passed between us, a shared understanding of just how absurd this entire situation was. Then she nodded toward Pod 7. Get in quickly, she said. We're launching all pods in 2 minutes, ready or not. The station's reactor containment is failing. You should evacuate as well, Colonel. I found myself saying. She gave me a thin smile. I will, once everyone else is away. I didn't have time to admire her species' occasional capacity for self-sacrifice, as Dr. MZRT was pulling me into the pod. The interior was cramped, with evacuation vessels clearly not designed for optimal comfort across multiple physiologies. A Syrian scientist was partially dissolved into the fluid environment in the center of the pod, while several Pleiadian diplomats had compressed their normally expansive tendril systems to accommodate more passengers. The pod door sealed with a pneumatic hiss, and a moment later we felt the thunk of docking clamps releasing. Then we were weightless, drifting away from the station. Through the small viewport, I watched as Proxima station receded, its once gleaming rings now punctured in multiple places, atmosphere venting in glittering plumes. Around it, energy weapons crisscrossed the void, the station's defensive systems engaging with what appeared to be a Draconian battlecruiser. In the distance, I could just make out the flashes of more combat as additional ships arrived in the system. The 23-year peace was officially over. Dr. MZRT oozed closer to the viewport. An inefficient allocation of resources, he commented. This conflict will set galactic economic development back by at least a century. All because one human's ego couldn't tolerate criticism. I replied, still processing the absurdity of it all. Not entirely accurate. Dr. MZRT corrected. The draconian response was disproportionate by any objective measure, and there were underlying tensions that had never been fully resolved by the peace accord. This incident merely provided the catalyst. Are you suggesting this war was inevitable? I asked. The Syrian scientist's body rippled in what I recognized as their version of contemplation. Not inevitable. Statistically probable, perhaps. Peace requires continuous work and adaptation. It appears the 5 species weren't quite ready for that level of sustained cooperation. Our pod shuddered as its automated systems activated the emergency hyperspace jump capability. The stars outside the viewport stretched into lines, then vanished as we entered the dimensional shortcut that would take us to the nearest neutral system. Doctor MZRT settled into the fluid environment for the journey. What will you do now, Junior Attaché Zyx'Talon? I considered the question as my chromatophores cycled through patterns of uncertainty. Record this. All of it. Someone should document how 23 years of peace ended because an alien insulted a human general's honor. A worthy endeavor, Dr. MZRT agreed. Though perhaps you might consider a more nuanced title. Epilogue. 1 cycle later, I sit in the quiet corner of a trading outpost on the Galactic Rim, far from the renewed conflicts raging across the core systems. My recording device captures these final thoughts on what historians are now calling the Second Galactic War. The conflict has spread, as these things tend to do. What began as a human draconian dispute quickly pulled in the Syrians when their major trade routes were blockaded. The Arcturians remain officially neutral, but are suffering greatly as refugee populations strain their limited resources. My own people, the Pleiadians, have fragmented, some factions allying with humans, others with draconians, most trying desperately to maintain some version of neutrality. General Jackson, I'm told, was court-martialed upon his return to Earth, but later reinstated when public sentiment turned in favor of a more aggressive military stance. Ambassador Klar now commands a draconian battle fleet. Both men who started this war through pride and insult now lead forces that have destroyed dozens of worlds. Colonel Patel, interestingly, resigned her commission and now works with a multi-species peace initiative operating in contested zones. I contributed my recordings to her efforts, though I maintain little hope for their immediate success. The appetite for conflict has grown too strong. The narrative of historical grievances too entrenched. Dr. MZRT sends me occasional encrypted communications from a hidden Syrian research facility. He calculates the statistical probability of peace being restored within my lifetime at approximately 12%. Not impossible, he notes, merely highly improbable. Yesterday, I received an unexpected transmission, an invitation to join a secretive diplomatic mission. Representatives from all 5 species, working outside official channels, are gathering on a remote world beyond the conflict zones. Their goal, draft a new peace accord, one that addresses the fundamental issues the previous treaty ignored. The odds of success are minuscule. The dangers substantial. The journey alone might kill me, that I've already accepted, of course, because if there's one thing I've learned from this absurd cosmic tragedy, it's that peace isn't a natural state for any of our species. It's an ongoing project that requires constant maintenance, like a temperamental biosphere dome on a hostile world. It fails when we take it for granted, when we grow complacent, when we forget what the alternatives look like. I transmit this final record before departing. Let it stand as both cautionary tale and instruction manual. Here is how galactic peace ended. Perhaps within it lies the seeds of how it might begin again. And if nothing else, let it serve as a reminder that throughout the cosmos, across species divides, one universal truth remains: never underestimate the catastrophic potential of wounded pride. This is Junior Diplomatic Attaché Zyx'Talon, signing off. May your chromatophores remain bright in these dark times.